would be the first to admit that his musical tastes were narrow. He liked some of Bach, nearly all of Mozart, some of Haydn. Beethoven, who he had adored as a young man, he now thought of as a bullying psychopath. And he had to admit that Schubert wrote some delicious melodies. But after that, the long procession of 19th century romantics left him cold, culminating in that miserable sod Mahler, who elevated self-pity into high art. And then the 20th century, the atonalists, the serialists, the brutalists, and the neoclassicists, the pastoralists, the social realists, the deconstructivists, and now, God help us all, the holy bloody minimalists, all striving for effect, no one blessed with innate genius. Surely no one was ever loved by God as much as Wolfgang Amadeus. To save expense, Harry sometimes shared a taxi home with Susan, who lived in the same direction. They did so this evening. Harry knew not very much about Susan. She was an attractive woman, but with a look of resignation about her eyes. He guessed she was about 38, and knew she had been married to a jazz trumpeter, but had been divorced for a few years. After a while in the cab, she said, "You're quiet tonight, Harry. Are you thinking about your solo?" "Oh, no." "So what are you thinking about?" He paused. "What am I thinking about? What am I thinking about?" He checked that the glass partition to the driver was fully closed. "I'm thinking that I'm 64 years old, and I would love to hold your breasts." There was a gulped pause. "I think times have changed, Harry." It seemed a perceptive comment, but then he wondered what it actually meant. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have been so rude. I don't know why I said that. It was awful. I am sorry." As the taxi stopped outside her flat, Harry offered to help Susan with her cello. "No need, Harry. Thanks, anyway." "So, good night, then." Harry was driven away, and he felt acutely embarrassed. What an idiot, he admonished himself. It was a further 10 minutes to Harry's home. Ruth was in her room. Her regular snoring was reassuringly audible. After nearly 40 years, they were still reasonably good friends, still shared holidays, but there was no lust or passion. They had had separate rooms for the last 5 years. Even through the walls, her snoring forced him to stuff his ears. A lot of musicians marry other musicians, but Harry had looked elsewhere. He didn't want to talk shop at home. Ruth had worked at the Trustee Savings Bank until it was privatised and she left in disgust. She was a socialist and Harry admired her for her principles. They had holidayed in Cuba and Russia. Despite the obvious shortcomings and the meanness of life which they saw, she still stuck to her principles, and he still admired her. He undressed quietly and washed. As he settled down to sleep, the light from the street lamp took up its familiar angle against the wardrobe. Susan's breasts were full and firm. Her nipples were long and taut. Young Mr. Mozart, in his grimy frock coat, was splayed across her, licking and slobbering frenetically. In between sucks, he uttered furious imprecations. "Don't go with Beethoven. He's mad. He's virgin. And mind Schubert. He's got the clap." Susan was transported. Her body heaved. She held Mozart's little head firmly to her breasts, and as she did so, his filthy wig came away in her hands. Harry sat up suddenly. "Oh, Jesus." It took him time to come round and for his eyes to see through the gloom. "Oh, Jesus." He had an aching erection. He groaned, 64 years old and still as horny as a teenager. He couldn't be bothered to relieve himself. He turned over onto his front to crush his member into submission. He slowly slipped back into sleep and dreamt of nothing.